Hi everyone, it's Maree, your 7K Metals Associate, and I have an amazing video that I highly recommend that every person not only watch, but watch it until you understand it, meaning you may have to watch it several times. This information should empower you to make critical decisions for your future that would be in solution versus fear. The person that created this is Mike Maloney, and it's very valuable information. First time in history, in conjunction with 7K Metals, one can now purchase gold and silver at wholesale prices without any minimums. So whether you have a budget of just $20 to $50 a month or tens of thousands, you will now be able to put yourself in a wonderful place of peace of mind for your future as you stash away gold and silver. This video will teach you why it's so critical to buy silver and gold now. Enjoy!
For this is the biggest hidden secret of money. Never in human history have so many been plundered by so few, and it's all accomplished through this, the biggest scam in the history of mankind.
They say that money doesn't grow on trees, but the truth is that the modern banking system creates currency far faster than trees can grow. Most people don't have a clue how currency is created. Economists and bankers make it sound so complex that people think they can't understand it. But I'm going to strip our monetary system down to its essence so that you can see the scam behind the curtain and just how it affects you. Every modern society creates currency in pretty much the same way. But since the US dollar is the majority of the world's currency, I'm going to use the United States as our example. It all starts when some politician says, "Vote for me and I'll make sure the government provides you more free stuff than my opponent will." But there's no such thing as a free lunch. So to provide that supposedly free stuff, the politicians vote for the country to spend more than its income. This is called deficit spending. To pay for that deficit spending, the Treasury borrows currency by issuing a bond. So what's a bond? If you think about it, a bond is really nothing but a glorified IOU. It's a pretty piece of paper with numbers printed on it that says, "Loan me $1 trillion today, and I promise over a 10-year period I'm going to pay you back that $1 trillion plus interest." But what you need to understand is that Treasury bonds are our national debt. These glorified IOUs are to be paid back by you and I and our descendants through future taxation. Therefore, when the government issues a bond, it steals prosperity out of the future so that it can spend it today. The Treasury then holds a bond auction, and the world's largest banks show up and compete to buy part of our national debt and make a profit on it by earning interest. You'll notice that as we move through this process, the big banks are there, taking a cut every step of the way. This isn't by chance, as you'll see shortly. Then, through a shell game called open market operations, the banks get to sell some of those bonds to the Federal Reserve at a profit. To pay for the bonds, the Federal Reserve opens up its big old checkbook and writes bad, bogus, counterfeit checks that should bounce because they're drawn on an account that always has a zero balance. There isn't one penny in there. To quote from the Boston Federal Reserve, "When you or I write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover that check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which that check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money." The Fed then hands those checks to the banks, and at this point, currency springs into existence. The banks then take that currency and buy more bonds at the next Treasury auction. But what is a check? A check is also an IOU. When you write a check, you're making a note that says, "Here's my IOU for cash. All you have to do is go to the bank and pick it up." Now, it's very, very important that you understand this process because we're going to come back later and show you the devastating effect this has on you. The Treasury issues IOUs, bonds. The banks then buy those IOUs with currency. The Federal Reserve then writes IOUs, checks, and hands them to the banks in exchange for the Treasury's IOUs, the bonds. And currency is created. So what's really happening is the Federal Reserve and the Treasury are just swapping IOUs, using the banks as middlemen, and abracadabra, presto, currency magically springs into existence. This process repeats and repeats over and over again, enriching the banks and indebting the public by raising the national debt. The end result is that there's a buildup of bonds at the Federal Reserve and currency at the Treasury. This process is also where all paper currency comes from. The Federal Reserve and the government mistakenly call it base money because they didn't watch episode 1 of this series and they don't know the difference between money and currency. But I will correctly refer to it as base currency because it is not money. It is currency, and as we've learned, there is a big difference. Money has to be a store of value and maintain its purchasing power over long periods of time. We learned in episode 1 that earlier in our history, our paper currency was just a claim check. It was a representation for real money of intrinsic value, the gold and silver that was held on deposit at the Treasury. You could walk into any bank and slap your currency, like say a $20 bill, on the counter and redeem it for real money, a $20 gold piece. But now, this base currency that's piling up back here is really nothing but a receipt or a claim check on an IOU, that bond. So it's really nothing but a supply of numbers. The Treasury then deposits the newly created currency into the various branches of the government, and the politicians say, "Hey, thanks for that." And the government does some deficit spending on public works, social programs, and war. The government employees, contractors, and soldiers then deposit their pay in the banks. Now, this may come as a shock to you, but when you deposit your currency with the bank, you're not actually depositing it into an account to be safely held in trust for you. Instead, you're actually loaning the bank your currency, and within certain legal limits, they can do with it pretty much anything they please. This includes gambling in the stock market and loaning it out, at a profit, of course. Now this is where the machine of currency creation really gets cranking, because this is where something called fractional reserve lending comes into play. Fractional reserve lending is exactly what it says. The banks are allowed to reserve only a fraction of your deposit and loan the rest out. Although reserve ratios may vary, I'm going to use a 10% reserve ratio as our example. If you deposit $100 in your account, the bank can legally take $90 of it and loan it out without telling you. The bank must hold $10 of your deposit in reserve just in case you want some of it. These reserves are called vault cash. But why does your bank account still say you have $100 if the bank has stolen $90 of it? Because the bank left IOUs it created, called bank credit, in its place. Now I know this sounds crazy, but here it is in black and white from the Fed. Commercial banks create checkbook money when they grant a loan simply by adding new deposit dollars in accounts on their books in exchange for a borrower's IOU. These are nothing but numbers that the banks type into their computers. And even though these bank credit IOU numbers are very different from base currency numbers, because they only exist in computers, they are still currency. So now there is $190 in existence. Now, the reason people take out loans from the banks is to buy something. They're going to buy a house or a car or something like that. So the borrower takes the $90 that the bank loaned to him from your account, and he pays the seller of the item. But then the seller deposits that currency into his account, and his bank loans out 90% of that and leaves bank credit numbers in its place. So now there's $271 in existence. This process repeats and repeats until under a 10% reserve ratio, an initial deposit of just $100 can create up to $1,000 of bank credit, all backed by $100 of vault cash, just 10%. But as I said, reserve ratios vary wildly. On some deposits, it's 10%, on others, it's 3%, and on some forms of deposits, reserve requirements are 0. The result is that the expansion of the currency supply by the banks is far greater than even this example would lead you to believe. So once again, when currency is deposited in the banks get to lend it out, and then it gets redeposited and relent, redeposited and relent, redeposited and relent over and over again, creating bank credit all the way. This is where the vast majority of our currency supply comes from. In fact, 92 to 96% of all currency in existence is created not by the government, but here in the banking system. Now, massive amounts of currency spewing into society may at first sound like a fun idea. That is, until you remember one of the most important hidden secrets of money from episode 1. that the prices of everyday goods and services act as a sponge on an expanding currency supply. The more currency we have, the more prices rise. This is where inflation comes from. The true definition of inflation is an expansion of the currency supply. Rising prices are merely the symptom. So our entire currency supply is nothing but a couple of bucks whipped up in this hocus-pocus scam where the Treasury and the Federal Reserve swap glorified IOUs, and a bunch of numbers that the banks just type into their computers. That's it. That's our entire currency supply. It's nothing but a supply of numbers. Some of them printed, most of them typed, and there is nothing else. But if you thought that was crazy, get ready to enter the twilight zone of modern economics. We work for some of that currency supply. True wealth is your time, but we trade away moments of our lives, hour by hour, day by day, and year by year, for numbers that somebody printed on pieces of paper or just typed into a computer. Now those numbers represent our blood, sweat, tears, labor, ideas, and talent. We are what gives the currency its value. But here comes the really cruel joke. We work hard so that we can save some of that currency, so that we can pay the tax collector. In the United States, it's known as the IRS. They then turn it over to the Treasury so that the Treasury can pay the principal plus interest on that bond that the Federal Reserve bought with a check drawn on an account that has nothing in it. Now let's do a recap on this section, because this is where the system begins to rob you and I on a massive scale. Much of our taxes are not used for schools, roads, and public services, but to pay interest on bonds that the Federal Reserve bought with a check drawn on an account that has nothing in it. The Federal Reserve is committing fraud. But here's one of the biggest secrets of them all. Before the establishment of the Federal Reserve, there was no need for personal income tax. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and that very same year, the Constitution was amended to allow income tax. Do you really think this was just a coincidence? Ask yourself how much income tax you've paid over your lifetime. Much of it has been silently siphoned away into the hands of those who own the system. Yes, this system has owners. Who they are is an even bigger secret that we'll get to shortly. But first, we need to understand the mumbo-jumbo of the so-called debt ceiling. It's all based on a huge paradox. There was interest due on that bond, and there was interest due on every one of those loans that the banks made. That means that there is interest due on every dollar in existence. Let me ask you something. If you borrow the very first dollar into existence, and that's the only dollar that exists on the planet, but you promise to pay it back plus another dollar's worth of interest, where do you get the second dollar to pay the interest? The answer is that you have to borrow that one into existence and promise to pay it back with interest as well. So now there are $2 in existence, but you owe $4, and so on and so on. The result is there's never enough currency to pay the debt. There is always more debt in the system than there is currency in existence to pay the debt. Therefore, the whole system is impossible. It is finite. It will come to an end one day. What would happen if the government stopped borrowing to do deficit spending? Are the payments on those treasury bonds going to stop? What would happen if the public stopped borrowing and going deeper into debt? Are your house and car payments going to stop? No. There is a payment due every month on the principal plus the interest on every dollar in existence, and those payments do not stop. If we stop borrowing, then no new currency is created to replace the currency that we used to make those payments. Whether you're making a payment on a loan or paying tax to make a payment on a bond, the portion of the payment that goes to pay off the principal extinguishes that portion of the debt. But the debt also extinguishes the currency. Currency and debt are like matter and antimatter. When they meet, they annihilate each other. If we just pay off the principal only on all the loans and bonds that exist, the entire currency supply just vanishes. So if we don't go deeper into debt every year, look what happens. The whole thing goes into a deflationary collapse under the weight of those payments. Politicians and pundits alike talk about balancing the budget, paying down the debt, and living within our means. They don't understand that that is deflationary. It is impossible to do under our current monetary system without collapsing the whole economy. This is why any talk of a debt ceiling is not only ridiculous, it's delusional. The system is designed to require ever-increasing levels of debt just to continue. And that's why politicians will always kick the can down the road and raise this so-called debt ceiling over and over again until the whole system finally collapses under its own weight. In other words, they don't want it to collapse on their watch. The Founding Fathers of the United States knew the dangers of central banking and fought to free themselves from this very thing. The Revolutionary War started out as a tax revolt, but now we must pay tax just to have a monetary system. Having just suffered through the hyperinflation of the continental dollar, which was printed into oblivion to finance the Revolutionary War, they understood the dangers of fiat currency and debt-based monetary systems. So to protect future generations from institutional theft and out-of-control government, they wrote into the Constitution that only gold and silver can be money for the simple fact that you can't print them. Our current system is not only unconstitutional, but it robs us of the liberty and prosperity our forefathers fought and died for. We are all feeling the effects of ignoring the Constitution right now. By forcing more currency into circulation, our purchasing power is diluted. Inflation is a slow and insidious stealth tax that is simply the result of this debt-based monetary system. This system empowers and benefits those who create the currency and receive it first, as they get to spend it into circulation before it has an effect on the economy. They're stealing purchasing power from you and transferring it to the banks and the government every hour of every day because of this false monetary system. And it's not like the people at the top don't know this. To quote the Federal Reserve, the decrease in purchasing power incurred by the holders of money due to inflation imparts gains to the issuers of money. This is a fraud. It is a pyramid scheme, it is a Ponzi scheme, it's a scam, and it's a lie. Our entire monetary system is nothing but a form of legalized theft. But here's the biggest con job of them all. The Federal Reserve is not federal, it has stockholders. There is no federal agency that has stockholders. What's a stockholder? A share of stock represents a percentage of ownership in a corporation. So the stockholders are the owners of that corporation. Therefore, the Federal Reserve is a private corporation with owners. And you can see it for yourself if you go to the Federal Reserve's website, and it will say, the stockholders receive an annual dividend of 6%. Now we know that the stock in the Federal Reserve was originally issued to the largest banks in the United States. But because of mergers and acquisitions through the years, you can't actually trace who owns the stock in the Federal Reserve. That's a very closely guarded secret. My guess would be that the owners are those primary dealers, the banks that get to make a profit by selling part of our national debt, those bonds, to the Federal Reserve, who buys them with a check from nothing. Then we pay tax to pay the principal and the interest on those bonds so that the Federal Reserve can pay the banks a 6% dividend. Don't be alarmed if you don't quite comprehend the deception of this system at first glance. Very few people do. It is purposely complex. The economist John Maynard Keynes once wrote, "By this means, government may secretly and unobserved confiscate the wealth of the people, and not one man in a million will detect the theft." I believe that presented correctly, anyone can understand this system, regardless of how complex it is. So let's do a recap and break it down even more. The way the system works is that, step 1, the government creates glorified IOUs. These bonds increase our national debt and put the public on the hook to pay it back. Step 2, IOUs are swapped to create currency. The Treasury sells the bonds to the banks. The banks then turn around and sell our national debt at a profit to the Federal Reserve, which they probably own. The Federal Reserve then opens its checkbook that doesn't have a penny in it and buys those IOUs with IOUs that it writes, checks, on a checking account that has a zero balance. Then they give those checks to the banks and currency just springs into existence, and then the whole process repeats. This results in a buildup of bonds at the Federal Reserve and currency at the Treasury, which is really just a supply of numbers. The Treasury then deposits the numbers in the various branches of the government, and we get to step 3. The government spends the numbers on promises, public works, social programs, and war. Then the government employees, contractors, and soldiers deposit their pay into the banks, and we get to step 4, where the banks multiply the numbers by magically inventing more IOUs through fractional reserve lending, where they steal a portion of everyone's deposit and lend it out. That currency gets redeposited, and then a portion is stolen again, and the process repeats over and over, magnifying the currency supply exponentially. Then we work for some of those numbers, which brings us to step 5, where our numbers are taxed. We pay tax to the IRS, who then turns our numbers over to the Treasury, so the Treasury can pay the principal plus the interest on bonds that were purchased by the Federal Reserve with a check from nothing. Then we get to step 6, the debt ceiling delusion. The system is designed to require ever-increasing levels of debt and will eventually collapse under its own weight because politicians always kick the can down the road. They don't want it to collapse on their watch. And finally, step 7, the secret owners take their cut. The world's largest banks own the Federal Reserve. Those banks make a profit selling our national debt to the Fed. They make a profit when the Fed pays them interest on the reserves held at the Fed, and the Fed pays them a 6% dividend on their ownership of the Fed. This system is fundamentally evil. It funnels wealth from the working population to the government and the banking sector. It is the cause of the artificial booms and busts of modern economies, and it causes great disparity of wealth between the rich and the working class. And it is only possible because we no longer use real money, we use currency. But worst of all, it is a form of enslavement. Bond is the root word of bondage. Whenever a government issues a bond, it is a promise to make us pay tax in the future. Nobody asked you if you wanted to pay tax today for the prosperity we all enjoyed in the last century. Nobody is asking our children if they want to work hard in the future to pay for the prosperity we're enjoying now. George Washington once wrote to James Madison, "No generation has the right to contract debts greater than can be paid off during the course of its own existence." By stealing prosperity from tomorrow so we can spend it today, we enslave ourselves and future generations. Now this all sounds pretty bad, but there is great hope, for you are the greatest threat to this false monetary system. This system relies on the public being ignorant of its workings. Please share this knowledge with everyone you know, because an informed public that fully understands the system can build a better future for generations to come. And now I leave you with this quote, widely attributed to a former director of the Bank of England. The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented. Banking was conceived in inequity and born in sin. Bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money and control credit, and with the flick of a pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again. But if you want to continue as the slaves of bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, let them continue to create money and to control credit. This is the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C. It's located on Constitution Street, and that is just as much of a joke as the New York Fed being located on Liberty Street. Both of them are unconstitutional, both of them limit our liberty, and they transfer wealth away from us every second of every day to the Federal Reserve, to the government, and to the banking sector. I'm Mike Maloney, author of Guide to Investing in Gold and Silver. It's the world's #1 best-selling book on investing in precious metals. It's available in 11 languages. And in my book, I said that we are on a wild roller coaster of a ride, and that we would first see the threat of deflation, followed by a helicopter drop, and that would be followed by big inflation, and that has happened. There was the 2008 crisis. We're seeing the base money around the planet being hyperinflated right now, while all of the credit aggregates are collapsing, and so it's sort of netting out to zero inflation or just slightly positive inflation, even though base money around the planet is just taking off like a rocket. but it would then be followed by a real deflation and then followed by hyperinflation. So I think it sort of looks like this. We've got the markets going up in the real estate bubble in 2007, and then we had the threat of deflation, which was the 2008 market crash and the big helicopter drop of currency, and you are here. And then I think that we're going into something like this, and it'll be followed by the world's central banks overreacting. People say, some people say I've been calling for hyperinflation, hyperinflation, hyperinflation. There isn't any time that I can find in all of history where a population that's all on one side of the boat, when you have a nation of debtors, what has to happen is that you go into a deflation first, allowing the banks to foreclose, and the public in general is on the losing side of the bet.
We are entering a period of financial crisis that is the greatest the world has ever known. The wealth transfer that will take place during this decade is the greatest wealth transfer in history. Wealth is never destroyed, it is merely transferred, and that means that on the opposite side of every crisis there is an opportunity. The great news is that all you have to do to turn this crisis into your great opportunity is to educate yourself. I believe that the best investment that you can make in your lifetime is your own education. Education on the history of money, education on finance, education on how the global economy works, education on how all of these guys, the central bankers, the stock market, how they can cheat you, how they can scam you. If you learn what is going on and how the financial world works, you can put yourself on the correct side of this wealth transfer. Winston Churchill once said that the further you look into the past, the further that you can see into the future. This program is all about creating your own crystal ball, being able to gaze into the future, being able to change this crisis, the greatest crisis in the history of mankind, into your great opportunity.
Well, I've been traveling overseas quite a bit, but I'm on my way home now to speak at an event in California finally. What I've been trying to make clear is the fact that this roller coaster crash that I was talking about in my book and that I've been predicting since 2005 is playing out right before our eyes. One of the things I really like about speaking at live events is the chance to interact with people and sort of get my finger on the pulse of what they're thinking. And lately it's become pretty obvious that for a lot of people it's difficult to grasp why I think deflation is coming before big inflation or even hyperinflation. So here I'm going to break down 4 of the biggest reasons that I see deflation coming first. The first one is simple. The overreaction to the 2008 crisis has caused a credit debt bubble, and all bubbles pop.
So I talked about hyperinflating base money. This is hyperinflation right here. Inflation and deflation is either an expansion or a contraction of the currency supply, and prices follow the inflation or deflation eventually. Now, most of this currency does not circulate. It's sitting on banks' balance sheets in what's called excess reserves. If you look at the years leading up to this crisis, this red line is reserve balances. The white line is how much of it is excess. And here we have Alan Greenspan's response to 9/11. Look at the scale of how big this emergency is compared to 9/11. But what is Ben Bernanke afraid of? And now Janet Yellen has inherited this legacy. Well, one of the things that happened in the 2008 crisis is that banks froze up and wouldn't lend to each other. They were all scared to lend to each other. And our system is such a fraud that at the end of each day, they all have to be able to borrow digits from each other that were created from nothing just to keep the whole smoke and mirrors game going. They all have to do this interbank lending to keep things balanced. Well, if one bank won't lend to another and they don't have any reserves, the whole system freezes up. Now, if you've got all these excess reserves that are on their balance sheet and you pay them interest to keep the reserves there and not use this as a basis of fractional reserve lending, they're going to be liquid. This basically prevents bank runs by banks on banks. It's not a public bank run with the public lining up at the doors. It's a bank run where one bank is trying to get their currency out of another or won't lend to another. And so this keeps things liquid. Right now, what this has done, though, the banks get to use this stuff in the middle of the day. And so you see the use of margin in the stock market going to record levels. You see the stock market going to record levels, things like, I follow collector cars, and they've been going astronomical. The number of $10 million cars out there now is just absolutely insane, and there are cars now selling for $30 million. Wine collections, art, it's all going ballistic at this point. And all bubbles pop. This is the average price of a new home divided by the median annual household income. Normally, 3-4 times your income is about what you can afford with a house. When you drop in interest rates, the affordability goes up, so people pay more for a house. But interest rates don't stay in one spot forever. They have to revert sometime or another. And all these people are going to be trapped. Every bubble pops, that's a bubble. We are in for something big again, and this time it's going to be more horrific than the crash of 2008, simply because the response to 2008 created a lot of stored energy. And then when the market crashes, that energy is released in the opposite direction. That previous chart of the hyperinflation of base money, well, we're going to get a reaction from all of this.
Whatever bubble you're in, the opposite happens of what is of greatest benefit to the most people. Right now, if we went into big inflation or hyperinflation, the average Joe six-pack would get rewarded for mass stupidity. They're all out on credit. We're in a credit boom. We're in a bond bubble. Those bubbles have to pop, and the popping of a credit bubble is deflationary.
It's deflationary. And history's crystal clear on that. A lot of the gold bugs say, the Federal Reserve and central banks, they're creating money, which they are unprecedented. But they're actually inflating to fight the deflation that started to set in the late 2008, early 2009. And if you look back at history, you say every major debt and financial asset bubble in history, the railroad bubble of the early 1870s at peak, followed by deflation. The auto and farm bubble and tractor bubble, that's actually a tractor bubble that caused the Great Depression. It was farms failing, and it was smaller local banks failing that caused the Great Depression and high unemployment. Deflation, because the deflation has to root out the massive debt and the financial assets that get overinflated. And it's good. If we bring down the cost of living, if we restructure debt, if we bring financial assets down, it actually improves our standard of living long term, but it is painful when it happens.
People think that the Federal Reserve can prevent deflation, that they control the money supply. Most people don't realize that the Federal Reserve controls base money only, and it's an incredibly small portion.
It was so tiny.
Right.
Yeah.
And all they do is influence the rest of the economy with interest rates and reserve balances and such.
Well, some people say the strategy didn't work. Well, no, it did work. We would have been in a depression, just like the early 30s. We were going that banks were melting down, financial institutions, major Fortune 100 companies were failing like AIG. We would have imploded because once you have that much debt and leverage and things go wrong, it just builds the other way. Like you say, you get a bubble on one end, you get a crash. Bubbles don't correct, they burst. So we were going into that, but government said, no, we will do whatever it takes. Mario Draghi, Ben Bernanke, and they created trillions of dollars to fill the hole. Well, all that does, it's like taking more drugs to keep from coming down. I mean, a drug addict can keep taking more drugs until it kills them, or until they just fall down and get dragged into detox. It's the exact same thing. Debt, especially when it's extreme, is a financial enhancing drug. It gives you more than you deserve, makes you feel better in the short term. But when it's over, you have to go through a detox, as they would call it, a debt detox. And that's where you get deflation.
This is the demographics of the United States back in the year 1940. And it's broken into 5-year age groups. And what I'm going to show you here is the baby boom and one of the reasons that we're going into this deflationary scenario. And we're also in this swing from individualism to collectivism. This is a pendulum, a cycle that just goes back and forth throughout time. And this is the greatest threat to your well-being and the well-being of the economy and freedom. We're going through a period where this demographic is going to cause some huge problems. So here we are in 1950, and you can see the beginning of that baby boom taking off. 1960, 1970, and this wave. Now, the reason I've got this broken up into these different colors, children are the ultimate consumers. They consume everything, they produce nothing, except a quality of life for their parents, you know, a big reward as far as seeing them grow up and so on. But economically, children are an economic loss. They consume economic energy. What you're seeing here is this wave coming into working age. The green area is sort of a break-even area. That's when people are getting a job, and it might be a minimum wage job or something like that, and might be sharing an apartment with a few other people. And then as you get into the yellow area, you start to become a net positive for society. You're paying income tax, you're producing more than you consume, and then you get into what's called the maximum spending demographic. The maximum spending demographic is ages 45 to 54. And this group lives in the largest houses of their lifetimes. They're driving the most cars of their lifetimes. They're sending their kids off to college. They're spending a lot. Then they become empty nesters. That's the maximum saving demographic. Once the kids are gone off to college, they go, holy moly, we didn't save anything, and we want to retire in 5 years or 10 years. And so they start saving, and then you get to the point where they retire, and they become a maximum social burden demographic, I call it, simply because they're liquidating assets. They've got their stocks and their savings, and each year they're going to liquidate some of those to live, and the only driver that in the economic driver is the medical industry. They drive the medical industry. So economically, the maximum social burden group is a net loss for the prosperity of society, the prosperity of an economy. And so I'm going to go back again, and you can see that that maximum social burden group almost didn't exist in 1940. And there's a lot of people of that working age and maximum spending age supporting the few people that were of the maximum social burden category. And then we get the baby boom sweeping through, and in the 80s and that stock market boom of the 90s and all the way up to 2000, that yellow area that really drives the economy was growing every year. Now, we have an economy where it's supposed to grow at about 3%, or it's going to stall. We inflate the currency supply at about that rate. But now, after the year 2000, we've got 2010, the peak of the maximum spending demographic. And from now on, it's sort of downhill. Maximum savers, they do help drive the stock market, but look at that maximum social burden category and look at what happens next. So we are going into this time period right now. Now, the reason there's no children on there is they haven't been born yet. But if you look at, when I first presented this a couple of years ago, birth rates have been falling for quite a while now, and they've been falling even at an even greater speed since the crash of '08. And if you look at the data from the Great Depression, birth rates just fell off a cliff in the Great Depression. And so you have less people of the younger age coming into this demographic to support the people that are retiring. They didn't have the pill during the Great Depression. Contraception was something that was not within most people's reach. So here it is automated, and you can see that big wave sweeping through there. And if you could imagine data for the children, it would be at a much lower rate. And if we do have a big economic pullback, you're going to see that really reduce. So we're in, most likely, some very serious trouble here, because all of our social programs and the way the economy and the society is set up, everybody's expecting to be able to retire at a certain age and live fairly comfortably off of the rest of us, off of the government. Any comments on these different age groups, maximum spending, demographic, maximum savings, and maximum
you've got the
social
same
burden?
model we do. What is unique at this time in history, and it's the main topic of my most recent book. That's why I call it the demographic cliff. This is the first time in most wealthy countries, there's a few exceptions, let's call it Sweden, Switzerland, and Australia, countries like that have a larger millennial or echo boom, but almost every other country has an echo boom that only comes up near the same heights or is much smaller, like Germany and Japan.
This echo boom here is what you're talking about.
So my question to people is, like you say, it is a pyramid. Each generation has been larger and more wealthy to help pay off the debts or the accumulation from an aging generation before them. What happens when the millennial is having to support a generation that's actually larger than them? And what happens when there's not enough for them to drive house prices back? I've got a model now for housing that says people spend the most on housing at age 41, but then when they die at age 79 or 80 on average, they become sellers. So I have to subtract the dyers from the buyers, and when I do that, baby boomers are going to be dying at higher rates than the millennials are going to be buying at some point, and there's going to be net negative demand for housing. Everybody's thinking, oh, we're going to need more housing forever. No. Not when a smaller generation follows a larger. So for entitlements, that's huge. There is no way this next generation in the US, nevertheless in Japan or Europe, where they're much smaller, can even hope to pay the entitlements been promised to the baby boomers. It's a fairy tale. And housing will never be the same. We saw the Bob Hope generation come out of World War II, the first middle-class generation in history, where the average person could buy a house on a mortgage. That was not the case in the Roaring '20s even. Only the affluent could do that. So that was a big boon for housing, and housing went out, the depression went away. Then the baby boom comes, unprecedented in numbers. All of our lifetimes, housing's gone up with a few exceptions here and there. Housing is going to do well to go sideways for the coming decades, nevertheless go up much again because of this generational shift. We've never seen this in history.
So now that we've covered three of the major components for deflation, I wanted to show you one of the real biggies here. And this one is the convergence of cycles. There's a whole bunch of cycles. The first one is the wealth distribution cycle, and I want to use my own family as a part of a demonstration of this. This is my father. He's right here. He's about the age where he enlisted in the Army to fight in World War II. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge. He was among the troops that liberated Dachau. Here he is in the mid-50s. He was manager of an auto parts store that sold high-performance equipment. And here's his tax return from 1955. He would have been filing this about a month and a half after I was born. And so what you see here is that he's a store manager in Salem, Oregon, and his income was about $9,600, and he paid about $1,160 in tax for an effective tax rate of about 12%. And you say, well, he only paid 12% because he didn't make very much, so he was in a really low tax bracket. But wait, this is median home values. This is US Census Bureau data. And here we have 1950 and 1960. So we're going to Oregon, 1950. A median price single-family home was $6,800, and in 1960 it was $10,500. So I'm going to say probably $8,500 is a happy medium there. Today, in Los Angeles, where I live, a single-family median price home is $360,000. Now, he was making enough, making $9,600. He was making $1,100 more than the cost of the average home in Salem, Oregon. So a auto parts store manager would have to be making $360,000 to maybe $420,000
and then paying only a 12% tax on it to equate to the same amount. And it's part of this wealth distribution cycle. This is the amount of national income that the top 1% earns. And back in the 20s, the end of the Roaring 20s, it was above 20% of the national income was going to the top 1% of the income earners. There's a trough here in the 70s where it got down to just 9%, but it's back up to 20%. And so, you know, in this area, the middle class was doing better, and paying less taxes. But on the trip there was the Great Depression right here. So getting back to that is going to be a very deflationary, painful thing. We've already seen the baby boom demographic, but I just need to show you one thing here. You recall that the maximum spending demographic drives the economy. The maximum social burden puts deflationary pressure on their economy. They sell their stocks, bonds, and real estate to survive, and they don't produce anything. But what I want to point out is that there's about 6 times more people driving the economy here in 1940 than there are putting deflationary pressure on it. And when you watch this wave go through, the drivers are always more until just the last couple of decades here. And now the people putting deflationary pressure on the economy exceed the number of people driving the economy. So if you could chart this out with time on that axis and the energy going into the economy on this axis, the curve would probably look something like this. And I believe that we are right about here, right about now. And now for the next cycle in this big convergence, the stock market cycle. This is the S&P 500 PE ratios. A PE ratio is the price of a stock per share divided by the annual earnings of that company per share. And if you're paying somewhere between 10 to 14 times annual earnings, that's fair value. Anything under 10 is undervalued, 14 to 20 is overvalued, and anything over 20 is bubble territory. And here comes the data. And what is important here is that when the stock market goes into a bubble, without exception, it has to visit undervalued before a new bull market can begin. Except for this time, the biggest bubble in history in the year 2000, and when it popped, we went down to fair value and bounced back up into a bubble. Do you really think that a new bull market can begin from here, that we're not going to visit extreme undervaluations? I don't think so. I think that we have to visit extreme undervaluations before a new solid bull market can begin. And now for probably the biggest factor in this convergence of cycles. This is Nikolai Kondratyev. He's a Russian economist that Lenin commissioned to prove that capitalism wouldn't work. He went away for a couple of years to do his studies and came back with his findings that capitalism was the superior system and would work marvelously well, but it would always suffer from these long wave boom-bust cycles to which he gave the names of seasons of spring, summer, autumn, and winter. We'll come back to this in some other episode and really dig into it. But for now, what you need to know is that the winter is the deflationary season. The last winter was the Great Depression. And they used to call this the 50-year cycle, but lately it's gotten stretched out and takes longer. I believe that it's got to be the length of a human lifetime. And the reason is that the winter is deflationary, and the people that were old enough to be of working age and have young families that lost the house, lost their job, lost the family farm, they become very emotionally scarred, and they become very risk averse and very, very frugal. And in order to make all the same stupid mistakes that we made in the Roaring 20s that led to the Great Depression, that generation has to die off. Well, they have died off, and we have made all the same stupid mistakes. So this is very deflationary, should it happen. And here's the supporting evidence. This is interest rates, and what you see here is that they go right along with the cycle. This is wholesale prices in the U.S. And again, they go right along with the cycle until the point the Federal Reserve decides that what we really need is constant inflation. This is one of the biggest cycles of all. It's hard for people to see, though. This east-west cycle takes about 500 years for the pendulum to swing each direction and 500 years back. It's innovation and prosperity swinging from Asia to Europe and North America and back. And in the Dark Ages, China was developing gunpowder. Then China stagnated while we had the Renaissance and Industrial Revolution. So ingenuity and prosperity does flow back and forth, and right now you should be able to feel that the Western economies are stagnating and have sort of stalled, while the growth in the Asian economies over the last 20 years has been mind-boggling. And so this is very deflationary for the West. And here is probably one of the most deflationary cycles of all. This is household debt as a percentage of disposable income. And alarm bells should really be going off when people owe more than their disposable income, anytime this exceeds 100%. But I believe that this is also a cycle, and that if we had data, if we could go back further, it would probably look like this. And what's interesting is that this reflects the seasons of the Kondratiev wave of spring, summer, autumn, winter. Spring, summer, autumn, winter. And we're going into a winter, and that's very deflationary. The next cycle you've seen before, we learned about this in episode 2, but it's the shift in world monetary systems. The classical gold standard, the gold exchange standard, the Bretton Woods system, the US dollar standard, and there's something that's coming next. These usually coincide with major wars, but whatever this next shift is, it's going to be chaotic, and it's probably going to be a little painful. It's not going to be pretty. Right now, we learned in episode 3 how countries are abandoning the US dollar standard at a blazing rate right now. It's developing stress cracks, and it's going to implode. And here's the thing, is that that is going to be happening with the convergence of all of these cycles. We have the East-West cycle, we have the baby boom demographic, we have the wealth distribution cycle, household debt as a percentage of disposable income, the stock market cycle, the Kondratiev wave, and the shift in world monetary systems. And the thing about all these cycles is that they have all peaked and they're starting to descend, which is deflationary. Deflation, 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 deflation. And that is all happening at the time when the world monetary system is developing stress cracks, it's about to implode, and it's going to be extremely chaotic. These things are all going to make it even more chaotic. So that's the convergence of cycles, and all of these things are the reason that I am expecting deflation before big inflation or hyperinflation. But just as I said in my book, any deflation is probably going to be short-lived. This is the nightmare scenario for every central banker, and all of the world's central bankers are Keynesians. They believe that they can print their way to prosperity, even though they have proved that you can't time after time. All it does is cause a wealth transfer. When all of the world's central banks start printing their currencies into oblivion simultaneously, what you will see is a wealth transfer where the vast majority becomes very poor and just a few people become very rich. It's horrible for the economy.
We're going to have another catastrophe sooner than later. It'll be bigger than 2008, but the next one's going to be strike 3. We've had 2 warnings. They've been ignored. The 3rd time, it's game over.
We are entering a period of financial crisis that is the greatest the world has ever known. The wealth transfer that will take place during this decade is the greatest wealth transfer in history. Wealth is never destroyed, it is merely transferred, and that means that on the opposite side of every crisis there is an opportunity. The great news is that all you have to do to turn this crisis into your great opportunity is to educate yourself. I believe that the best investment that you can make in your lifetime is your own education. Education on the history of money, education on finance, education on how the global economy works, education on how all of these guys, the central bankers, the stock market, how they can cheat you, how they can scam you. If you learn what is going on and how the financial world works, you can put yourself on the correct side of this wealth transfer. Winston Churchill once said that the further you look into the past, the further that you can see into the future. This program is all about creating your own crystal ball, being able to gaze into the future, being able to change this crisis, the greatest crisis in the history of mankind, into your great opportunity. Hi. In the last episode of Hidden Secrets of Money, I spoke with Harry Dent about deflation and the reason that we both feel that it's absolutely inevitable. In the bonus feature, I talked with Harry about some of our differences, and he believes that it's going to be a long, drawn-out deflation. I believe it's going to be a very short-lived deflation, followed by potentially a hyperinflation. And the reason is something we're going to talk about in this episode, and it's velocity of currency. And that is all controlled by psychology. I'm very fond of saying that the economy is both psychological and psychological. It runs in waves and cycles, and those waves and cycles are very logical because of the psychology that's going on behind it. And that psychology controls the velocity of currency. Now, I like to teach through the looking glass of history. So I'm going to read you a little bit of my book because there's a perfect example of this in the Weimar hyperinflation. And after I'm done with the book, we're going to come back and we're going to look at some data so that you get a full understanding of what velocity of currency is and how it affects you. So, on page 16, we have, at the beginning of World War I, Germany went off the gold standard and suspended the right of its citizens to redeem their currency, the mark, for gold and silver. Like all wars, World War I was a war of and by the printing press. The number of marks in circulation in Germany quadrupled during the war. Prices, however, had not kept up with the inflation of the currency supply, so the effects of this inflation were not felt. The reason for this peculiar phenomenon was because in times of uncertainty, people tend to save every penny, and World War I was definitely a time of uncertainty. So even though the German government was pumping tons of currency into the system, no one was spending it, yet. But by war's end, confidence flooded back along with the currency that had been on the sidelines, and the ravaging effects worked their way through the country as prices rose to catch up with the previous monetary inflation. Just before the end of the war, the exchange rate between gold and the mark was about 100 marks per ounce. But by 1920, it was fluctuating between 1,000 and 2,000 marks per ounce. Retail prices shortly followed suit, rising by 10 to 20 times. Anyone who still had the savings they had accumulated during the war was bewildered when they found it could only buy 10% or less of what it could just a year or two earlier. Then, all through the rest of 1920 and the first half of 1921, inflation slowed, and on the surface the future was beginning to look a little brighter. The economy was recovering, business and industrial production was up. But now there were war reparations to pay, so the government never stopped printing currency. In the summer of 1921, prices started rising again, and by July of 1922, prices had risen another 700%. This was the breaking point, and what broke was people's confidence in their economy and their currency. Having watched the purchasing power of their savings fall by 90% in 1919, they knew better this time around. They were smarter. They had been here before. All at once, the entire country's attitude toward currency changed. People knew that if they held onto their currency for any period of time, they'd get burned. The rising prices would wipe out their purchasing power. Suddenly, everybody started to spend their currency as soon as they got it. The currency had become a hot potato, and no one wanted to hang on to it for a second. Now, on the next page, I talk about
the front page of the New York Times 1923, and I referenced some information there. And I just happen to have a reprint of the front page of the New York Times from 1923. And there's an article here about the German hyperinflation. But what I find more interesting than that is the entire paper is this wonderful time capsule. And if you replaced the names and dates and names of countries and so on in most of these articles, it would all be pertinent today. You'd think that you were reading today's newspaper. But when it comes to this article on the German hyperinflation, it talks about these paper mills pumping out 45 billion marks per day. Now, this is the February edition of the New York Times. By November, those paper mills were pumping out 500 quadrillion marks per day. So now we're going to take a look at velocity and how it could affect us in the future. So this is me. Now, I developed this keynote presentation to make understanding velocity easy. Most economists make it sound really complex and people don't think they can understand it. But stick with me, I think you'll enjoy this. When you're measuring velocity, you're measuring the number of times each unit of currency changes hands. I'm going to have lunch and I'm going to pay the waiter, I'm going to tip him $1. And then he parked in a red zone that morning, so his car got towed. He's going to have to take a cab home, and he's going to pay that cab driver that same dollar when he gets to his destination. Then later on that day, the cab driver is going to have to fill his cab with gas, and he's going to use that same dollar again as part of the payment to pay for his tank of gas. So that dollar was used in 1, 2, 3 transactions. It had a velocity of 3 that day. In other words, $1 bought $3 worth of goods and services. Now we're going to kick this up a notch, and we're going to call this a country of 10 people, this economy of just 10 people, and their currency supply is $1. That's the only dollar that exists. And it circulates once, and so you've got $1 times a velocity of 1 equals a GDP, the size of the economy, is $1. If it circulates twice, it's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So $1 times a velocity of 10, or 10 transactions, equals a $10 GDP, the health of that economy. Now, if you expand the currency supply, we've given each one of these people $1. If they all make a transaction, there has now been 10 transactions, but each dollar was only involved in one of them. So it's a currency supply of $10 times 1 transaction each equals a $10 GDP. So even though you've got 10 times the currency supply, the economy has the same vibrance. There was 10 transactions, it equals $10. Then we have a second transaction, a third, a fourth. This could be a healthy economy. It could also be an economy running into hyperinflation. Keynesians, that's the type of economists that are running the modern day economy, believe that you can create a healthy economy by changing this figure here, the size of the currency supply. So the Federal Reserve thinks that by adding currency to the economy, that they're going to be able to stimulate it and make the economy grow. And the thing is, it isn't the quantity of currency, it's the amount of goods and services that are created in that country that determines the country's level of prosperity. So if you just add a bunch of currency, all it's going to do eventually is drive up prices. Velocity will slow at first, and that's what we're seeing now. Well, the same thing happened in Weimar Germany. This is the entire hyperinflation from the beginning of World War I in 1914 until the end of 1923. And most economists are attracted to this big hyperinflation on the end. But one thing I discovered when I was writing my book is that there's almost always a pre-hyperinflation hyperinflation. And we see one here, where there's this rise of prices and quantity of currency, and then it levels off for a little while, and then rises again. And this has to do with the psychology.
This is the time where I said those people had been there before and experienced that. I'm going to zoom up on it. And so here you see the currency supply increasing. So they're doing monetary inflation, but prices stay level, and the price of gold actually dropped toward the end of the war. But as soon as the anxiety is lifted from the population and they start feeling better, all of that currency comes out of hiding and people start making transactions, and velocity picks up, and prices, and the price of gold especially, just rose dramatically and then leveled off some 16 times higher than they were originally. Notice that the currency supply is growing at a certain rate. The prices are delayed, and then bam, they rise to meet it and exceed it, and then stabilize to account for that quantity of currency. Now back to this original chart here, what I find interesting is that during the war it lagged, and then it caught up and matched the currency supply. But then as they kept on printing, velocity started to exceed the currency supply. So prices started to rise faster than they were printing currency, and that's the end game for hyperinflation. The big lesson here is that the people who owned gold and silver instead of the national currency came out relatively unscathed, or even made huge gains in their purchasing power. Now, this is the US currency supply from 1918 until today. And we've created all of this currency, but we haven't seen any ravaging inflation yet. And that is because velocity has fallen to compensate for the creation of currency. But there will come a time when the psychology of the country changes, and you will see, after this short-term deflation, where velocity falls even further, you will then see the velocity pick up and prices will rise. And I believe that we will go into a hyperinflation because they're going to create more currency than this. And that currency is going to be sitting there, and velocity will have slowed and slowed and slowed to compensate it until something changes psychologically. The beginning of every hyperinflation looks like everything is okay again. Mm-hmm. The economy gets better, velocity picks up, and that's the really danger point, and nobody can see it as velocity starts picking up.
Right, well, of course, there's a name for that. It's called money illusion, which is before the inflation really kicks in and either gets extreme or turns into hyperinflation. There is this feel-good period where, there's more money around, and, unemployment's dropping and people feel more prosperous. The prices haven't quite skyrocketed yet. It's all illusory because it'll go away once the price level adjusts. But there is that kind of, period in between, and it is a feel-good period, but it doesn't last very long. But you're making a very good point, which is a lot of people assume that inflation is a function of money supply or money printing, and that's not right. It's a partial function of money supply, but the other part of the function is behavioral. It has to do with velocity, which is just a psychological phenomena. Do you feel good? Do you want to go out for dinner? Do you want to take your friends? Do you want to take a vacation, or do you want to stay home, leave your money in the bank, and watch TV? Those are two different states of the world, based a lot on your confidence and how you feel. Both things have to come together to get the kind of inflation the Fed wants. Now here's the problem. They can make the money supply whatever they want. They're certainly printing trillions of dollars, we understand that. So far, they have not been able to bend the velocity curve. They have not been able to get you and me and everyone else in America and around the world to spend more money. But let's say they do. They change the psychology, they change the behavior. Once you change it, it's very hard to change it back. It's not like throwing an on-off switch. I mean, it's taken years for the Fed to kind of try to inject an inflation scare, try to get some inflation. But what if it actually comes? What if inflation goes from 1% to 3% in a matter of 6 months and stays there and looks like it's going to 3.5%? Well, the next stop is 10%. It's not, the Fed thinks they can dial it back down to 2.5%, which is what they say they want. But what they'll find is once that velocity, once that behavioral genie is out of the bottle, they won't be able to get it back in. It'll take off. It'll take on a life of its own. What's the Fed going to do? Raise interest rates to 10% with unemployment at 7%? I mean, people go down and burn down the Fed. I mean, there are limits on what they can do. But the point is, once it starts, and you're exactly right, it's a feedback loop. It feeds on itself. The Fed thinks they can control it. They're wrong. The behavioral aspect of it will be out of control, and like I say, we'll be on our way to 10%, if not worse.
It seems like all of these bright minds that want to run things, none of them trust the free market mechanism.
Well, I think that's right. They will talk to you ad nauseum about the failures of the free markets without realizing that most of the so-called failures are actually the result of misguided government policies from prior times. I'll give you a classic example. 1998 was a warning. That's, started in 1997. Capital outflows from emerging markets started in Thailand. There was blood in the streets in Jakarta and Seoul. Made its way to Russia. Russia imploded, took down the hedge fund long-term capital management. I was associated with that, so I had a front row seat on that disaster. And finally, the world built a firewall around Brazil, and Brazil did not collapse, although it would have been the next domino to fall. Now, there was a clear-cut lesson. Capital markets came within hours of complete closure. And I was there. I sat with Peter Fisher, who was head of open market operations at the Fed, his associate Dino Cost. We were on the phone with Bill McDonough, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Gary Gensler was there from the Treasury, all the lawyers, all the bankers on Wall Street. We were trying to hold this together. Now, we did bring it in for a soft landing, so the world has kind of forgotten about that episode. But it was extremely close and extremely delicate. We were literally hours away from shutting down global bond markets and stock markets. Now, what lessons were learned? Well, the lessons...
Well, that cascades into the credit card not working and the gas not coming out
Correct.
of the pump.
That's right. There would have been a global bank holiday, we were
Yes.
hours away from that. Now, it didn't happen, so everyone's like, oh, no big deal, it's fine, but there were some lessons that should have been learned. Banks should have been broken into smaller units. Derivatives should have been banned, et cetera. There were things that should have been learned from that. Instead, what did? We did the opposite. We repealed Glass-Steagall, which allowed banks to be hedge funds. We repealed swaps regulation, which allowed them to create swaps and derivatives on all kinds of other things that had never been done before. We repealed the net capital rule for broker-dealers, so instead of 15-to-1 leverage, you were allowed to have 30-to-1 leverage, which Lehman had on the day it went down. We implemented Basel II, which allowed banks to use more leverage. We did the exact opposite of what we should have learned in 1998. Is it any surprise that 10 years later, we had a bigger catastrophe, almost destroyed capital markets again, and now here we are not learning the lessons again. We haven't done anything we need to do, so therefore, we're going to have another catastrophe sooner than later. It'll be bigger than 2008, but the next one's going to be strike 3. We've had 2 warnings, they've been ignored. The third time, it's game over.
I don't see any particular difference between my outlook and yours. Certainly a situation where society owes more than it can pay, and where it has to default, either honestly or dishonestly, is deflationary. Debt liquidation.
Honestly being just a default. We are bankrupt, we can't pay you.
Yeah.
Dishonestly inflating the debt away.
Exactly. Honestly would be to say to the bondholders, yeah, that's right, we say we're going to pay you back, and we say we're going to pay you back with interest. Well, too bad, so sad. Times are tough, we lied. Strong letter to follow, right? Say to guys like me, you're 60? Yep, I know you're supposed to get Social Security when you're 62 or 65. The truth is, we don't have the money, so you're not going to get it, right? That's the honest way. I think the yield to politician is very low with regards to the honest way. So I think that we're going to have deflationary scares, and I think we're going to have deflationary events. I think we're going to have asynchronous events like long-term capital management and things like that, that will initially have deflationary outcomes. But I suspect, like you, that the demand for the public will be for the big thinkers to solve that problem and solve it in the only way they know how, which is to fill every crack, even the Grand Canyon, with currency.
So how is this all going to play out? I don't know exactly, but what I do know is that the longer this goes on, the bigger it's going to be. And I wrote about some of the possibilities in my book. And this was written before the crisis of 2008. And so in here, I refer to Ben Bernanke, but I'm going to change that to just the Federal Reserve or central banks for you right now. So, the day of reckoning will come when millions of baby boomers reach the age where they have to take mandatory distributions from their IRAs. As they find that the investments they were counting on for their retirement, their homes and their IRAs full of mutual funds, have actually lost value, that the amount of stuff that they can buy from the proceeds if they sell their home is actually less than when they bought their home. And as they realize that their dream of a comfortable retirement was just that, a dream, all those boomers will get scared and pull in their horns. They will stop spending. They will start selling off their assets, and the greatest stock market crash in history will unfold as more and more boomers panic and sell. I believe this will also be accompanied by the greatest real estate crash the world has ever known. This perfect storm of bankruptcies and foreclosures will cause the currency supply to contract as the giant credit bubble pops, and all those big spenders become big savers. When people save their currency, it stops circulating. The economic engine runs out of oil, and the whole thing locks up. This is every central banker's worst nightmare. This is real deflation, and the world's central bankers are about to discover the true scale of the horrors of a credit bubble implosion. When this happens, the Federal Reserve will once again send out its armada of money bomb-dropping helicopters, but this time something will be different. Something will have gone horribly wrong. The bombs will have been defused. The Fed will try pumping the banking sector by buying up every kind of debt they can get their hands on, but to no avail. They will go to the extraordinary measures that they had said they were prepared to go to. They will buy every mortgage, mortgage-backed security, and any other type of debt that panicky investors and banks are trying to sell, but nothing good will come of it. They will start buying stocks to buoy the stock market, but retail sales will continue to plunge. They will try broad-based tax cuts, but it won't jumpstart the economy. They will work with foreign central banks to buy each other's debt, but the global economy will continue to plummet. People will finally see through the veil. They will see what Dorothy, the Scarecrow, the Lion, and the Tin Man saw, that the Wizard of Oz is really just some dopey old guy frantically pulling levers. Remember when we talked about how during World War I, the Germans increased their currency supply by 400%, yet there was no price inflation because of the public's anxiety over the war and the uncertainty of their future? Imagine the anxiety 75 million baby boomers will feel as they approach retirement, only to find their homes and their mutual funds are now worth next to nothing. The nest egg, ladies and gentlemen, has just cracked. When they get their tax rebates, are they going to buy that new big screen TV and the latest cell phone? I think not. I think they're going to save every dime they can get their hands on, just like in Germany during the war. But there will be a point at which a threshold is reached. For each income class it will be different. It will be the point where they feel that they've finally got enough saved for retirement. For some it will be $100,000, for others it will be $1 million, and for others still it will be $10 million. The Fed knows there is a point where they'll finally feel safe enough to replace that aging computer and maybe get that new TV. At this point, the boys at the Fed will buy enough government debt to fund tax rebates for all the taxes in the previous year, but still, nobody will buy that new car. The threshold the Fed is looking for will not be reached. Then, in not-so-quiet desperation, the Fed will say, "Screw the helicopters, send in the bombers." And as the shadow of millions of stealth currency bombers darken the skies, currency will begin to fall like rain in the desert. As Joe Sixpack and John Q get tax rebate checks in the mail for all the taxes they paid during their entire lifetimes, fear will be temporarily alleviated and some of that currency will come out of hiding, just as in Weimar Germany. Prices will rise quickly and dramatically as all that stored up currency energy is released. In a panic, the Fed will call back the bombers, but it will be too late. There's nothing they will be able to do to stop it now because the hyperinflation will have already begun.
The Dow will begin an invisible crash of epic proportions, and gold prices will shoot to the moon. If you are wise enough to moor your boat in the safe harbors of gold and silver and other commodities, you will weather the storm. It won't be pretty, but at least you'll be safe. At this point, confidence in the currency will fall faster than it can be created. Cost of living increases for government employees, and the costs of all government projects, the subcontractors, the labor, the materials, will all skyrocket. And each time more currency is created to pay for the increases, the value of the currency will fall even faster. In times like that, governments have only two choices: shut down the government and all of its projects and services, send everybody home without pay, turn off the printing presses, and wait for the free market system to discover price levels that account for the quantity of the currency in the supply, or print the currency into oblivion. Governments have always chosen the latter. But the stored up energy of excess currency creation doesn't have to take place within the United States, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in the future. In fact, there is an abundance of stored up currency just waiting to be released right now. As I mentioned earlier, all the dollars we sent overseas to other countries to buy their goods and services are now sitting in their bank accounts, just waiting to be spent. Eventually, the world economy will lose faith in the US dollar and will want to dump it by buying up goods. And as all those dollars come flooding back into the US, it will, of course, cause the prices of those goods and services to rise, and could, and probably will, trigger a scenario much like the one I have just finished describing. Throughout history, economists have suffered from what I like to call this time syndrome. This time, they've become masters of the economic universe. This time, they've figured it out. This time, they've tamed the economy. This time, they've mastered the art of infinite currency amplification. This time, a fiat currency will work. History gives this a probability of 0. Each time we sailed toward economic doom, the greatest financial minds in the world were at the helm. Do you really think we should continue letting them steer the ship? I think not. It would be nice if we started listening to people that have been right rather than the people that have theories. And it would be great if they would allow the free market to work, but that's not the way it's going to happen. The people that have the theories will continue to rule, and we will vote for people that don't know what they're doing. And so the best that we can do is try to protect ourselves and even, potentially benefit from government and economists' stupidity.
You are now among the 1 in a million who can detect the theft of your prosperity. So the big question is, what can you do about it? 1. Watch this video until you can describe and teach it to others. Those who understand this system can make preparations for its unavoidable collapse and protect themselves. History shows that those who don't will probably be wiped out. 2. Share this video with everyone, especially those you care about. All it takes is a mouse click or two to get this message in front of millions. Post this video on Facebook, tweet it, email it to loved ones. Please share it wherever you can. 3. Join the conversation. The current world monetary system is based on a 300-year-old design meant to enrich a few at the expense of the many. There must be a better way. At hiddensecretsofmoney.com, we've created an open-source platform for the design and development of a new world monetary system. We're calling on every economist, every student, every college, every bright mind, and anyone who cares to join the discussion. In educating ourselves and each other, we can prevent the further loss of our freedoms and maybe, just maybe, win some of them back.
For years before I got involved in really studying gold and some of the things I write and talk about today, I was a monetary economist for decades. In your video, you talk about the primary dealers. I was chief counsel and chief credit officer of one of the largest primary dealers for 10 years. So I had an inside seat on the Treasury market and have the privilege of working with several former vice chairmen of the Board of Governors, Manley Johnson and David Mullins, going back to the 80s and the 90s. So I'm very immersed in what you were talking about. And I thought it was extremely accurate, extremely clear. I didn't think you were stretching on any points. It was really like something out of a PhD course, except that it was very easy to understand. I think it's accessible. I think we're seeing a little bit of a revolution in communications in the following sense. You know, as you point out, the Fed was created in 1913. Well, in 1913, there was no web, there was no YouTube, no Twitter. There was really no one to kind of stand up and oppose the Fed or call them out, if you will, or really get into a discussion that everyday Americans could follow. That's not true now with social media and everything else. You can reach out to millions and tens of millions of people and tell them what's going on. I think you've done that. You've done it successfully. I applaud it. I think this is a great video. I look forward to seeing it again. I know millions of people will enjoy it.
Well, as we know, the Federal Reserve believes it can create money out of thin air, not realize money is supposed to represent real products and services. And what people don't realize is when the Fed does that, in effect, as Keynes pointed out, it's a form of taxation. It's a form of confiscation. And because people don't see it, the politicos get away with it, but it also undermines social trust. It just is corrosive throughout society. We're going to have a lot of turmoil in the coming years, but it's going to be the kind of turmoil that leads to positive things. So don't despair. Get out there and fight, because the tide is going to turn. This is going to be the status last stand.
Thank you.
If you're curious about 7K metals, please go to silverstasher.com. It would be an honor to be able to speak to you about it, answer any questions you have, and satisfy your curiosity. Thank you.